Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. It never seemed fair. Maybe you remember something like this from your elementary school days. You spent the morning perhaps working on multiplication tables or how to form a cursive Q. Whatever, you were brain dead and watching the clock as it ticked down to recess. Then, two kids all the way across the room get caught talking, and the teacher suddenly announces that recess is canceled for the whole class. It wasn't fair. And probably what you learned the most that day wasn't 3 times 12, but that whether we like it or not, we're in this all together. We're in this all together. You know, most of the time that's a pretty good thing. We have each other for support and help. But sometimes, well, as we continue looking at bad guys of the Bible, let me tell you the story of Achan. It's not a well-known story, and in truth, it can be a very difficult story too, often settling uneasily within us and leaving more questions behind than it answers. You'll find the story basically in Joshua 7, but it all really starts before that, with a story you do know well. It starts when the walls come tumbling down. When all the Hebrews at long last entered the promised land, the first place they came to was Jericho. And when Joshua presented the battle plan God had given him, they must have thought he was crazy. They were just going to march around the walls of the city for 7 days, and on the 7th day God would do something. Nobody knew what. And there was only one rule. Any treasure, any items, anything found within the city could not be kept. Everything was designated as sacred and belonged to God. That was their way of acknowledging that this victory was not something they had done, but God's action, God's victory. So the spoils of the war were God's, not theirs. Well, as you know, the walls came tumbling down, and it wasn't long before it was time to move on to their conquest of the land. The next place was a small city of Ai, and puffed up with the victory at Jericho, with hardly a thought and without any prayer, they sent a small force over to take it, and got soundly defeated. So that's when Joshua prayed. And when Joshua accused God of abandoning his covenant to lead the people, God promptly let him know that the problem was on Joshua's side. Someone had kept some of the devoted things from Jericho. So they had to root out the sin, to cut it out like a cancer growing within them. They cast lots by tribe, and the tribe of Judah was chosen. And then they cast lots by families in that tribe until a man named Achan was chosen. And Achan confessed the whole thing, telling them exactly where he had hidden the stolen goods. And when it was all said and done, Achan and all his family were stoned to death, and all their possessions were burned with them. And the place where this happened was named the Valley of Achor, or the Valley of Trouble. And then once again, God was with them. And right there in the story, the story comes home to us. We're in this together. As much as we might like to think that our actions affect no one but ourselves, the story of Achan tells us differently. It was Achan who sinned, but the sin was accounted to all of them. Achan sinned, but the consequences of his sin were shared by them all. You see, there's a vertical dimension to your relationship with God, yes, but there's a horizontal one too. And far too often we forget that. That's one of the reasons communion is so important. As we gather around God's table, we come guilty. Guilty this way and guilty this way too. But we are forgiven and fed, filled with grace and love, renewed this way and this way. We are God's family, in need of God alike, and alike in receiving God. Alike and together forgiven. Alike and together made new. And then there's this. Let's go back to elementary school one more time, this time to English class. That's where we learned that the word you is both singular and plural. It can mean you as an individual, or it can mean y'all as you all together. And maybe when we come to communion, as we kneel there, as the bread and wine are placed in our hands, when the pastor says the body of Christ given for you, maybe, just maybe, we should hear it both ways. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.